Okay, so now we're going to ask the question we've always got to ask, which is, how does this point to Christ? How does this point to the Christ? The whole of the Old Testament points to Christ. So how does the time of the judges point to Christ? Well, firstly, remember how God keeps raising up a deliverer to save the people, like Gideon, like Samson. Well, ultimately, God sends Jesus as our deliverer. Jesus is the one who saves us from bondage to sin and to Satan. So it points to Christ because it shows that God is in the business of sending deliverers, and ultimately the big deliverer he sends later on is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is the perfect deliverer. So when you go through the book of Judges, you see these deliverers and you're like, man, these guys have got some serious character flaws, you know. And so you come to Jesus and you're like, this guy is perfect. You know, you get Samson who messes up with a prostitute. Well, when Jesus comes, he has a prostitute wash his feet, and you see Jesus treat her with total purity, the way that she should be treated. And we see this man is the perfect deliverer. Second thing is that during this time, God arranges for the seed of the woman to be protected. So if you remember, Genesis 3:15, God promises in the Garden of Eden, he says that the seed of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent is going to bruise the seed's heel. And there's this battle going on between the seed. And as we've been going through the story of the Bible, we have this question that keeps coming up: who's the promised seed? Who is it? Now, through the time of the judges, you see a lot of bad things are happening, and you've still got that question: what about the seed? Well, what happens is right after the book of Judges in the Bible, you get the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is set in the same time period. And it's a time where everything's going bad, but then you see a foreign woman, Ruth, come and join the people of God. It's a bit like Rahab earlier. Rahab's a foreigner who joins the people of God. Ruth joins the people of God. She gets rescued by a bloke called Boaz, who's called her Redeemer, which points to Jesus because Jesus ends up ultimately being our Redeemer. And Ruth has a baby who then grows up and has a baby. And on and on and on. And eventually from that line, Jesus is born. And this is the seed of the woman that's promised in Genesis 3:15, who crushes the head of Satan. So what we see is during this terrible time of the judges, God is preserving the seed. It's going through Ruth and Boaz and then going down. God is keeping the seed so that he can destroy the devil's work. So it points to Jesus in that sense. But also it points to Jesus because in the book of Judges, it keeps mentioning there was no king in those days. Israel had no king in those days. And you've got this theme that keeps coming up, letting you know, hey, there's a problem during the time of the Judges. Moses has died, Joshua's died, and they don't have a king. That's why these people can't function. They don't have a king. And that's pointing to Jesus, because eventually Jesus Christ comes and he is the King of Kings. Yeah. And so this points to Christ. Whenever you read there's no king, you think, yeah, but there is a king in the end, and that's Jesus. And then lastly, I think it points to Christ because in the book of Judges, you see that the people just weren't able to obey God. They just can't do it. You watch them just like you watch Adam. You're like, even Adam can't obey God with this perfect setup. And you see his children, his son. It's like he can't obey God, Cain. And right now you see the judges, and you're like, the judges can't obey God. God's people can't obey God. And then what happens is Jesus Christ turns up years later, and Jesus Christ lives as a man. He's God who becomes a man, and he lives a perfect life in perfect obedience to God. And Jesus basically comes and says, I will live the perfect life that God's people have never been able to live. And that's why Matthew, in Matthew's Gospel, refers to Jesus coming out of Egypt. Remember, Jesus as a little boy has to flee to Egypt, and then he comes back to Israel. And Matthew uses the Old Testament quotation, out of Egypt I have called my son. And what Matthew's saying is, back in the Old Testament, God called Israel out of Egypt, and that was God's son. And now that Jesus is on the scene, God's saying, this is my new Israel that's coming along. This is my son, and he's going to live his life out perfectly the way that Israel never could. So when we see the people mess up in Judges, it points to Christ, because we're like, yeah, God's people can't obey God perfectly, but Jesus is going to come, he's going to obey God perfectly, and then his righteousness is going to be credited to the account of all of his people. So, we're just going to end now with this discussion question. When we tell people the gospel, how can we communicate to them that God has sent Jesus as a deliverer? This is clearly an important thing we get from Judges, that Jesus Christ is our deliverer. So when we share the gospel to people, how can we communicate that? And let's practice doing that in twos, and if you can, use the whole Bible meta-narrative in the way that you explain that.